Hi everyone, and welcome back to Chapter 3. In this lecture, we're going to begin a discussion regarding some of the more specific types of behaviors that may serve as precursors to actual sex crimes. To begin with, this is a lecture on sexual deviance. As I have said to you before, sexual deviance and criminal behavior can be one and the same, but they do not have to be mutually exclusive events. During this lecture, we're going to first define deviance in a general sense, and then we're going to describe what sexual deviance actually is. We're going to describe specific types of sexual deviance, meaning the different types of sexual behaviors that an individual can engage in that would constitute sexual deviance. We'll talk about when those behaviors start and stop, what might encourage someone to engage in a specific behavior, and we'll contextualize everything under this umbrella term of paraphilia. Let's go ahead and get started. So as I said, we need to start by defining deviance in a general sense. Deviance is any kind of behavior that we engage in that violates social norms in a particular society during a certain time. This means that behaviors we engage in the United States might be considered deviant elsewhere, like the Middle East. But in more sexually liberal countries, like many European countries, other behaviors would not be considered deviant as they might be here. Also, we have to take time into account. Currently, we are more sexually liberal than at any other time in history. Think about the many different TV shows and movies that we see depicting sexual behavior. 50 Shades of Grey, for instance, brought S&M into everyone's home, and we can have an open discussion of bondage in the bedroom. We wouldn't be able to do that in the 1950s when TV shows portrayed a husband and a wife sleeping in separate beds. When we talk about deviance, there are many different definitions that can be based on individual interpretations of the term. Therefore, we try and shy away from the term normal. We never want to describe someone's behavior as normal because to me, this might be the most abnormal type of thing I've ever seen. But to you, it's something that feels comfortable and right. Think about the number of things that you do on a daily basis that others might not do. For example, cigarette smoking is at an all-time low in the United States because we now know about the health risk that smoking presents. It's a legal behavior, but because the majority of Americans do not use tobacco products, your smoking may be considered deviant by your peer groups. But when we're trying to identify deviance, we need to ask ourselves two questions. What is being labeled deviant? And who is being labeled deviant? That's a big term to place on someone or something, so we need to figure out this concept just a little bit more. When we talk about deviance in terms of labeling, we need to discuss primary and secondary deviance. As your book discusses, Lemert's categories of deviance allow for individual and group level sanctioning. When we talk about primary deviance, this is something that an individual may see no problem with at all. But for the rest of his or her social group, they do object to the behavior and may impose an informal or formal label on the individual in question. For example, let's say that someone engages in a sex crime of some sort. That is both deviant and criminal behavior. Once they get caught, they are formally labeled a sex offender by the court. This person has engaged in primary deviance according to Lemert and has been formally labeled by the court. Then, the same person who has now been labeled feels as though the world will only see them as a sexual offender. They are labeled, they are ostracized, and they are no longer part of the social collective. As an outcast person, this offender may feel as though there is nothing to lose because they will never be able to shake the label of sex offender. So they commit another deviant or criminal act because they are living up to the label. This is considered secondary deviance. Any type of deviant behavior that results from the informal or the formal label is considered secondary deviance. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts, but that's the concept. So, when we look at a deviance from a sociological perspective, there are a ton of theoretical reasons for why a person would engage in this type of behavior. You may have already heard of some of these from your theory class, but these all suggest that deviant behavior could be the result of disorganized environments, economic or social strains, being part of a deviant subculture, from the application of a formal or informal label as we have just discussed, or from being under formal or informal social control mechanisms. but really as many different theoretical explanations as there are to account for deviance, what it really suggests is that there is no one way to account for this concept. The term is subjective based on the individual and the group level differences that we see. Think back to my example regarding cigarette smoking. I might be fine with smoking, but others might not be, and they think that it's a terrible thing to do. Go to Europe and they're smoking everywhere. Go back in time a few decades and everyone is smoking all the time. So when we're talking about all types of deviant behavior, it's difficult to really capture deviance into one specific definition or concept. Once we get into the sanctioning aspect of it, individuals can be subjected to informal or formal sanctions by communities. Informal sanctions are those that are imposed by family and friends and have no legal standing whatsoever. For example, your parents might kick you out of the house, your friends might abandon you, or you might not be allowed to come to family gatherings anymore. Rumors might circulate about what you've been doing in your free time. You are stigmatized on an informal level. Keep in mind that informal and formal sanctions can happen at the same time, but again, are not mutually exclusive events. In terms of formal sanctioning, these are the things that will be done by the state and by the court. You break the law, you are convicted, and then you receive a sentence of X number of years in prison or X number of community service hours. This helps to identify deviant behaviors that are also criminal. But remember that while the state is formally sanctioning you, all of the above formal sanctions could also be happening simultaneously. So as I said earlier, we want to try and avoid the term normal. There is no such thing as normal sexual behavior. There might be things that more of us engage in than others, but there is no such thing as normal sexual behavior. This is because we all engage in some sort of deviance at some point, whether it is sexual or non-sexual in nature. We all do it. Think about it. How many of you may have consumed alcohol underage, or tried marijuana in places where it is illegal, or used someone else's Netflix password with or without their permission? These are all forms of deviance, but when it comes to sexual deviance, things get a little more murky. Human beings are sexual creatures, and engaging in sexual activity is healthy for us. There are a lot of medical benefits to engaging in sexual activity by ourselves or with a partner. What we hope for is consensual and legal encounters with another person. But beyond that, there is a wide variety of things we can engage in that may or may not be considered deviant in nature. For many, sex is still a taboo thing to talk about, but for a greater number, sex is a very regular activity in their lives, and they are very open to doing a variety of different things. So, depending on who we're talking to, the same behavior could be considered deviant or not deviant in nature. The definitions from before apply here, but now we're discussing everything in terms of specific sexual behaviors. Typically, when we discuss specific behaviors, we can contextualize them from a few different standards to determine whether that behavior may or may not be considered sexual deviance. First, we have the statistical standard. This means that if more than 50% of the population engages in something, then that something would be considered normative or non-deviant. A good example here is masturbation. Easily more than 50% of the United States population masturbates, so that would fit here. The issue with this standard is that if someone does not engage in a specific behavior, like masturbation, then they would be considered the deviant ones. Let's say for this example that 95% of the population masturbates. Then the remaining 5% that does not masturbate would be considered deviant. We have already discussed the cultural standard a little bit as we have talked about our friends, family, and social environments that all have an influence on whether a specific behavior is considered deviant. In ancient Greece, for instance, it was culturally acceptable for adult men to take a young boy as a lover while they were married. This was a sign of high social rank in that environment, in that culture, in that time. Now, if you tried that today, you would be arrested and convicted. So there's a strong cultural difference here. Religious normalcy also plays a big role. In many religions, premarital sex is still considered a taboo sexual practice, even though many people engage in that type of behavior. but from a religious perspective, it would be considered deviant. Your own personal religious beliefs and your own level of devout following would have a major influence here. Finally, the most important one is the subjective standard. This is basically an individual level decision based on all of the other factors and prior engagement with different behaviors. If an individual has engaged in X before and didn't like that, then they might consider that behavior a deviant behavior. If they liked engaging in behavior X, they might want to go further with it. Personal definitions might evolve over time, meaning that they are not static. Further, they might evolve based on what cultural or societal norms are at the time. When we are talking about sexual deviance, we are often talking about the concept of paraphilias. Paraphilias are defined as an intense, persistent sexual interest in something other than what we consider normative action. We are talking about things that might be focused on an object, a specific body part, or a specific type of behavior, but definitely something that is erotic in nature. Paraphilias are largely male-oriented, but individuals from all races and statuses can suffer from paraphilic disorders. Most paraphiliacs do not become violent in nature. Normally, we don't know which individuals are engaging in specific paraphiliac behaviors because they never come to our attention. Furthermore, paraphiliac acts rarely come to the attention of authorities due to the private nature of the behaviors, the involvement of strangers, the quick actions involved in the act, or victims not realizing that they have even been victimized. Paraphilias must be distinguished from criminal offenses as the language for both is commonly used interchangeably. Many of the behaviors that we discuss today are not illegal, but in some cases they can be. But it is important to note that the sexual desire is not the thing that we have an issue with. It is the behavior. For example, a person cannot be convicted of pedophilia, but he or she can be diagnosed with pedophilia. The person can be convicted of child sexual abuse, however. It is a nuanced difference, but we need to make that point clear. Today we're going to discuss all of the paraphilias that you see on your screen. We'll begin with exhibitionism, and we'll make our way through voyeurism. We'll talk about the legal and illegal instances in which these paraphilias can occur, but our purpose today is really to define and discuss the sexual desires that these types of paraphiliacs seek to fulfill. We begin with exhibitionism. This is one you're probably a little bit familiar with already. When we think of exhibitionism, we tend to think of a flasher, someone who opens their clothing quickly to reveal their genitalia for a shock value and then runs off. They might never have any other interaction with the person after that. This is certainly one form of exhibitionism, but people engage in other types as well. Having consensual sex in public is another form. What is important here is that other people can see you engage in this behavior and may watch you, but you don't specifically want any physical contact with the person who is watching you or who can see you. In terms of victim selection, the exhibitionist might be an opportunist or might be looking for someone specific. That is normally an individual level decision. But in terms of harm, this really isn't too harmful of a behavior for the victim. There might be a level of shock, embarrassment, or disgust involved, but normally this doesn't carry a level of psychological trauma as other types of victimizations do. In order to be diagnosed with this type of paraphilia, the standard is typically 3 different occurrences. Next up, we have fetishism, which you also may be familiar with. This one seems to be well integrated into popular culture, so many people know about it in that sense. When we talk about fetishism, it is normally a sexual attraction to a non-living item or towards a body part. So one person might be sexually aroused by their partner wearing high-heel shoes or a specific outfit. Really, when we talk about fetishes, nothing is off limits at all. There are TV shows dedicated to people who have actually fallen in love with inanimate objects. I have placed a video clip on your class website for you all to watch. Most commonly, the objects aid in the sexual experience with another person, but they can also be used as a masturbatory aid as well. Many fetishes are harmless and often involve clothing of some kind. But as I said, nothing is off limits here. Fetishism can be diagnosed once the person exhibits sexual desire or attraction to an object for more than 6 months and the desire is consistent in nature. On this slide, you will find a variety of different types of fetishes. When a fetish is geared towards a body part, that's when it's called, or considered rather, a partialism. So, for example, if the attraction is toward the high heel, then it is a fetish. If the attraction is geared towards a person's foot, then that is considered a partialism. The terms often get confused, but you can see here the sky is the limit. Common partialisms are geared towards a person's eyes, feet, stomach, or amputated limbs. Common fetishes are directed towards shoes, dolls, water, and urine. This is just a short list, as I have mentioned before. But again, nothing is really off limits here. If we're talking about Frotteurism, we're discussing a behavior in which a person experiences sexual arousal from touching or rubbing up against a person who does not consent or who may not even know what's happening. Normally, this type of action happens in crowded areas where there are a lot of people or areas where that contact is unavoidable. A person might be having a drink in a crowded bar, or might be standing on a crowded subway car, and all of a sudden a person rubs up against them from behind. This may be a frotter who is trying to rub up against you. Normally, the frotter rubs his or her genitalia on the unsuspecting person, or might rub up against another person's genitals or breasts. This is one that is especially hard to detect because it is difficult to differentiate between a frotter and just someone who is being jostled in a crowded place or who cannot avoid contact with another person when they are simply trying to make their way off that subway car. Pedophilia, on the other hand, is much more worrisome than some of the others that we have discussed so far. This one, if acted upon, has some of the largest potential for harm for the victim. Pedophilia, as you may know, is sexual attraction or desire in prepubescent children, typically those who are younger than 13 years of age. If you know someone who is attracted to older adolescents, then it is inappropriate to label them as a pedophile. As we mentioned before, pedophilia is different than the actual action of engaging in sexual actions with a child. I know this is a difficult concept for many to wrap their minds around, but there are pedophiles out there who never act on their sexual attraction because they know it's wrong. There are others who do sexually abuse children, but who are not clinically diagnosed with pedophilia because they do not meet the requirements for the paraphilia. So this goes both ways. However, a true pedophile who does act on his or her urges will do so systematically. They will take time to groom their victim, find a victim who is easily accessible, or they will work in areas in which they are frequently surrounded by children. But these individuals will not harm the child beyond the actual sexual violation most times. Think about it this way. When you engage in sexual activity with your spouse or your partner, you normally don't want to harm that person. You want to enjoy the activity, but typically don't want to harm that person or your partner beyond that. This is the thought process of the pedophile. A child is their preferred sexual partner, and they do not seek to hurt their victim. Like all other paraphilias, pedophilia does not become diagnosed until the person acts on their desires or until it becomes a reoccurring enough problem to cause disruption in their life. This is not something that can be diagnosed until the person is no longer an adolescent themselves. Once the sexual desire is strong enough and there is a large enough age gap between partners, the individual can then be diagnosed with pedophilia. Normally, this paraphilia does not go away, but it is more easily treated than others. Although there are female pedophiles, this affects men more so than women. As I have said before, if you are attracted to post-pubescent adolescents, then you would either be a hebephile or an ehebephile, depending on the gender of that adolescent. Sexual sadism is one of those paraphilias that can be consensual or non-consensual in nature. This type of behavior focuses on an individual's desire to see another person, who may be their sexual partner, suffer. This could be through physical or psychological means. Typically, this is some sort of humiliating behavior, or you're making the person do something that is degrading in nature. Many people volunteer or allow their partners to do this to them. The other side of this behavior is sexual masochism. If you enjoy having this done to you, then you are a sexual masochist. There are different layers to sexual sadism. If you have an agreement with your partner, then you agree to specific things that you are both willing to do. Everything is agreed upon before you begin your sexual encounter, and you agree not to cross any boundaries that aren't already agreed upon beforehand. This type of sexual sadism is legal and requires consent. On the other side of the spectrum, those sadists who do not seek consent often desire to perform very harmful sexual actions. This could involve pain and injury beyond the sexual activity, use of a weapon, or some other form of torture. This could coincide with rape or even homicide, but that's an extreme version of this practice, and often it doesn't go that far. Like everything else, sexual sadism isn't diagnosed until something happens in the life of the person or until they act on that desire. Sexual masochism is the other side of the equation. In this case, you desire to have someone perform these actions on you. You desire to feel pain or be humiliated by your partner. In order to be a sexual masochist, you consent to the actions being performed on you. So you need a sexually sadistic partner who is willing to perform these actions with you. Like sadism, masochism exists on a spectrum in which things can be really simple or they can be very intricate and complex. However, what is important here is that both partners feel comfortable and are willing to engage in this action. The limits of each person are also agreed upon before the sexual activity begins. Like other types of paraphilias, this one has an early onset and can be diagnosed after a period of 6 months or more. There is debate as to whether or not this one is even a paraphilia, but as of right now, it is still considered one and you can still be diagnosed. Transvestic fetishism is an interesting type of paraphilia because people often confuse this with either gender identity issues or with issues of sexuality. In some instances, it can be used for those reasons, but most often this is something that mainly occurs involving heterosexual men without any type of gender identity concerns. Transvestic fetishism is when a man dresses in women's clothing for sexual pleasure or because he enjoys the feeling of comfort that the action provides. Many times, young boys will watch their mother's dress and remember those experiences. Dressing this way later on in life may serve as a connection to their mothers or as an attachment to that time in their lives. This can also occur in a variety of different formats. It does not need the individual to dress completely like a woman in totality. Some individuals may wear women's underwear underneath their regular clothing, and we never know that this was happening. Others dress completely like a woman. This is not the same thing as dressing in drag for entertainment purposes. Like everything, this paraphilia cannot be diagnosed until after a certain period of time or until the behavior causes some sort of harm or distress in the life of the actor. For our final paraphilia of the day, we have voyeurism. This involves taking sexual pleasure from watching someone who is engaging in something sexual or who is naked and does not know that they are being watched. This could be equated to a peeping Tom of sorts. Part of the thrill is in being caught. You might be hiding somewhere watching a couple engage in sex and masturbating while you watch. Part of you wants to get caught and the other part wants to remain hidden. Some pornography websites allow for live streaming of sexual activities. This is not the same thing as voyeurism in the true sense because the intent is for people to watch you engage in sexual activity online. Voyeurism, rather, is really about watching someone who doesn't know that you're watching. So today we focused on a bunch of different types of sexual activities and paraphilias that affect the lives of many people on a daily basis. But as we mentioned, not everything is illegal, but it is still considered deviant in nature. Your textbook goes into greater detail for each of these paraphilias, so I recommend you read that as well. This chapter was important because sometimes these paraphilias act as the precursor behaviors to full-blown sex crimes. Many offenders start at this stage, and when this is no longer enough to satisfy their sexual urges, they intensify their behaviors and graduate to behaviors that are more harmful in nature than these paraphilias are. That's where we will pick up this discussion next time when we make our way into Chapter 4 when we discuss rape. See you all next time for that lecture. Bye!